The morning mist hung low over the Russian countryside. The air, still and grey, carried no sound of life. But beneath that silence, thousands of men stood shoulder to shoulder, staring into a void that would soon become hell. Napoleon was no longer chasing glory. Not here. Not now. In the heart of Russia, his Grand Army was fraying at the edges. Supplies were stretched thin. The march was long and bitter. His men, once invincible in the west, now stared across strange rivers and burned villages with hollow eyes. What stood ahead of them was not just another battlefield. It was a wall of Russian steel. Since crossing the Niemen River in June, Napoleon had moved east like a firestorm. Towns fell, cities burned, but each step forward came at a cost. The Russians, under General Mikhail Kutuzov, refused to fight a decisive battle. They retreated, burned their own homes, destroyed supplies, and left behind scorched earth and desperation. Napoleon hated this kind of war. There was no glory in chasing shadows. He wanted Borodino because he needed it. He needed one crushing blow, one grand victory, something so total that the Russian spirit would break, and the road to Moscow would open. He finally got what he asked for. In early September 1812, just west of Moscow, the Russian army stopped running. Kutuzov, older and more patient than his predecessors, had chosen his ground carefully. A small village, Borodino, would become the place where over 250,000 men would clash. The fate of an empire would be decided in a single, blood-soaked field. On September 5th, Napoleon stood on a rise overlooking the Russian position. Before him were hills fortified with earthworks, cannon, and layered defenses that stretched for miles. He saw no fear in the enemy lines, only determination. The kind that does not shatter easily. The kind that does not run. That night, French soldiers huddled around campfires, sharpening bayonets, checking flintlocks, and writing final letters. Some laughed loudly, pretending not to notice the way their hands trembled. Others stared at the stars, already lost in thought or prayer. Napoleon walked among them in silence. He had won many battles, Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. But Borodino was different. He could feel it in his bones. This was not strategy. This was not maneuver. This was slaughter. And still, he ordered the attack. Because he believed, as he always had, that the force of will could break any defense, that if he struck hard enough, fast enough, the enemy would collapse under the weight of his ambition. What he did not know was that the Russians were ready to die where they stood. And the field at Borodino, that small stretch of muddy earth between two rivers, would drink more blood than any battlefield Europe had ever seen. Before the storm came the spark. September 5th, 2 days before the main battle, Napoleon tested the Russian line. He ordered Murat's cavalry and Prince Eugene's infantry to seize the redoubt at Shevardino, a small wooden fortified outpost jutting from the Russian left flank. It was more than just a position. It was a trigger, a probe, a blood price paid in advance to measure just how hard the Russians would resist. The French attacked with fire and fury. Cavalry thundered across the open field, swords flashing. Artillery pounded the walls. Infantry surged forward, bayonets fixed, as the Russian guns roared back. The redoubt held. Russian grenadiers fought like wolves, tearing into the French advance with brutal discipline. The air filled with powder smoke, screams, and the wet crunch of bodies hitting the dirt. The small outpost became a furnace. Men fired until their barrels melted, then fought hand-to-hand with shattered muskets and rusted blades. Murat himself, reckless and proud, rode dangerously close to the front lines. His cavalry broke through, only to find Russian reserves waiting in the trees. The French were driven back, then forward again, then back again. By nightfall, Borodino was in ruins. The French had taken it, but at a terrible cost. The dead littered the field like broken statues, dismembered, blood-soaked, motionless in the fading light. Horses lay twisted in agony. The cries of the wounded echoed deep into the night. It was just a preliminary skirmish, but over 8,000 men had fallen. Napoleon studied the aftermath with an unreadable expression. It had taken nearly the entire day to take a single outwork, and the main Russian line still stood, untouched, stretching like a coiled serpent beyond the Kolocha River. Kutuzov, watching from afar, had allowed the loss. Borodino was bait a sacrifice to mislead and delay. Behind it, the real defenses braced for impact. The Great Redoubt at the center, the Flèches on the left, and layers of artillery in between. His army was bloodied, but not shaken. The next day, both sides prepared in silence. French engineers built gun emplacements by moonlight. Russian soldiers reinforced earthworks, hauling logs with blistered hands. Mass was said on both sides. Generals exchanged final words. Commanders gave orders with steel in their voices and grief in their eyes. On the morning of September 7th, the sun rose on Borodino like a knife through smoke. A mist curled above the fields. The ground was wet, soft, and uneven. In the distance, cannon wheels creaked. Muskets were loaded in silence. Flags were unfurled. No one spoke of glory anymore, only survival. Napoleon rose before dawn and stood atop a small knoll. His staff waited for grand instructions, but the emperor said little. He looked out at the Russian defenses, then at his own lines. He saw veterans he had led across Europe, men who had fought at Marengo, Austerlitz, Wagram, now older, tired, yet still willing. He raised his hand. A single cannon fired. Then 100 more. The Battle of Borodino had begun. The first blow came at the left. Napoleon had chosen to attack hard and fast. At the Russian flank, a cluster of arrow-shaped field fortifications, called the Flèches, dug into the hillside and bristling with guns. To take them was to drive a wedge into the enemy line. To fail was to be buried in it. Marshal Davout led the charge. His men were veterans, cold-eyed and unflinching. At dawn, they moved like shadows across the wet field, under a sky still bruised with morning mist. French cannon roared behind them, shaking the earth. But the Russians were waiting. As soon as the French stepped into range, the sky tore open. Artillery thundered from the Flèches, not just cannonballs, but case shot, a storm of iron pellets that tore through limbs and armor. Whole lines vanished in seconds. Screams mixed with the sickening thud of metal on flesh. Still, the French advanced. They reached the outer works. Bayonets flashed. Muskets fired at point-blank range. The dirt turned black with smoke and red with blood. Frenchmen climbed over corpses to breach the earthworks, only to be driven back by Russian counterattacks. Then they charged again. By 9 a.m., the field had already changed hands 3 times. Russian soldiers refused to fall back. General Bagration, the soul of the Russian left, rode among them like a phantom, shouting, bleeding, urging his men to hold. And they did, for hours. The Flèches became a graveyard. French and Russian bodies were stacked so high that men slipped in blood trying to scale them. Wounded soldiers fought from the ground, stabbing blindly as hooves and boots crushed them underfoot. The smell of powder, sweat, and death clung to the air like a disease. Napoleon, watching from afar, did not reinforce Davout with his elite imperial guard. He was cautious, too cautious. He believed the Russians would break without committing his reserves. But they didn't. Instead, a fresh Russian corps arrived. Kutuzov had thrown his weight behind the left. The French, exhausted and bleeding, were driven back again. Then Marshal Ney entered the fray. With him came another wave of French infantry. Columns surged forward once more. This time, the Flèches finally gave. Bagration was struck by a shell fragment and collapsed. His troops, seeing their general fall, wavered. And in that moment, the French surged over the last rampart. The Flèches had fallen. But the victory was hollow. Thousands of men had died for a few hundred yards of earth. Blood filled the trenches. Smoke choked the sky. And Bagration, their lion of the south, was dying. Kutuzov wept in silence. He knew the worst was still ahead. Because, while the left had bled, the center had yet to break, and at its heart stood the Great Redoubt, a fortress of fire, waiting for the next wave of death. By midday, the battlefield was drowning in fire. Smoke hung in the air so thick that men fought blind, stabbing at shadows, coughing blood between screams. The sun was gone, hidden behind a ceiling of gunpowder and ash, and yet the worst was still ahead. In the center of the Russian line stood the Great Redoubt, the Raevsky Redoubt. A massive earthwork braced with timbers, manned by over 20 cannons, and defended by thousands of infantry packed shoulder to shoulder. It looked like a wound carved into the land. It would become a mass grave. Napoleon knew he had to break it, or the entire battle would stall. He ordered Ney, Murat, and Eugene to launch a direct assault. No flanking, no clever maneuver. Just a headlong charge into the mouth of death. The French lined up in tight columns, infantry at the front, cavalry to the flanks, artillery behind. They moved forward like a black tide across the torn-up field, stepping over bodies, through craters, across what was once grass, and now was only blood and ash. The redoubt came alive. Russian guns fired from behind walls of dirt. Each blast tore through the French ranks like the hand of God bodies hurled backward, limbs shredded, heads turned to mist. The French kept coming. Cannonballs skipped through their lines. Muskets cracked. Men screamed. Horses screamed louder. Still, they charged. French cuirassiers, heavy cavalry in shining breastplates, rode through fire like armored phantoms. They stormed the front of the redoubt, leaping over trenches, slashing through defenders, only to be shot down by point-blank volleys from the walls. Then the infantry surged. They clawed their way up the embankments, bayonets clashing, fists swinging, stabbing and kicking through the earthwork like animals trapped in a pit. Inside the redoubt, it was chaos. Men were crushed against each other, unable to swing weapons. Muskets became clubs, shovels, teeth, fists. Anything became a weapon. Blood slicked the ground. The wounded screamed and crawled over the dead, only to be trampled by the next charge. And then the French broke through. After hours of slaughter, the redoubt fell. French soldiers poured into the smoking crater, shouting in triumph, only to be struck by a Russian counterattack. Kutuzov had sent in his reserves. The redoubt changed hands again. Back and forth, 3 times, 4. By the time it was finally secured, nothing remained but mangled flesh, splintered wood, and burned metal. The French stood atop the ruin, too numb to cheer, too tired to raise their weapons. One officer wrote, "The earth was breathing death. The dead lay in layers. The living walked through blood." But even as the redoubt fell, the Russians did not break. Kutuzov pulled back not in panic, but with calculation. His line folded, not collapsed. He left the field not as a beaten general, but as a survivor. His army lived. And Napoleon, though standing in victory, had paid for it with more than 30,000 of his own men. He had won the field, but not the war. Not yet. Ahead, the road to Moscow stretched silent and open. Behind, Borodino smoldered, and the land wept for the dead. When the cannons fell silent on the evening of September 7th, there were no songs. No cheers, no flags raised. Only the crackle of fire licking the battlefield and the soft moans of the dying buried beneath heaps of the dead. Napoleon remained on the field, surrounded by the wreckage of his victory. He had taken Borodino, the bloodiest single-day battle of the Napoleonic Wars, but when he looked across the smoke-choked plain, there was no glory, only silence and corpses. Over 70,000 men had fallen in less than 12 hours. Some were crushed by cannon fire. Others bled to death alone in the mud. Entire regiments had vanished into the smoke and never returned. One French general later wrote, "We had won, but there was nothing left to win." The Russians had retreated, but not broken. Kutuzov had preserved his army scarred, shattered, but intact. He had traded ground for time, time that Napoleon didn't have. The French army was exhausted, ammunition low, food scarcer still. The Grande Armée had advanced too far, too fast, across scorched land and burnt villages. The deeper they pushed into Russia, the farther they were from safety. And still, Napoleon pressed on. He believed Moscow would end it. That if he reached the Russian capital, Tsar Alexander would finally kneel. The war would end. The continent would be his again. So he marched forward over the bones of the fallen. For days, the army crept toward Moscow. The road was eerily empty. The Russians had vanished. No resistance. No ambushes. Just trees, fog, and the ghostly echoes of carts rolling over blood-soaked soil. On September 14th, Napoleon stood before the gates of Moscow. What he saw stunned him. The city was deserted, abandoned by its people, the government gone. The silence was unnatural. No church bells, no soldiers, no weeping women, no pleading citizens. Just wind and the distant flutter of torn banners. And then the fire. That night, Moscow began to burn. Ardent flames erupted across the city, leaping from roof to roof. Entire districts vanished in the smoke. The blaze consumed everything: homes, markets, supply depots, hope. It wasn't an accident. It was strategy. The Russians had set their own capital alight to deny Napoleon shelter, food, and triumph. For 5 days, Moscow burned. The fire devoured more than wood and stone. It devoured the illusion of victory. Napoleon, standing in the ashes of a city he never truly conquered, realized what Kutuzov already knew. You can take the land. You can kill the men. But if you can't make the enemy surrender, you have won nothing. In his memoirs, Napoleon would later write, "Moscow was a graveyard, and I was its ghost." The victory at Borodino had opened the gates to Moscow. But behind those gates was not peace. It was ruin. Napoleon had taken Moscow, but Moscow would not save him. He waited there for over a month, expecting a messenger from the Tsar, a peace offer, a white flag, something, but nothing came. No letter, no envoy, just the sound of winter approaching. The Russians refused to surrender. They had lost their capital, their soldiers, their homes, but not their will. Kutuzov's army lingered in the distance, watching, waiting, letting time finish what their guns had begun at Borodino. And time did its work. The cold came early. First frost, then snow, then hunger. By October, Napoleon understood the truth. He could not hold Moscow. He could not feed his army. He would have to retreat. So the Grande Armée, what was left of it, turned west. They had entered Russia as over 400,000 strong. They left as shadows. Men without coats, without food, without hope. They stumbled along frozen roads, past villages burned twice over. Horses died where they stood. Men fought over scraps of leather. Soldiers froze to death standing upright. The same roads they had once marched with songs were now lined with the dead, buried in snowdrifts, their faces frozen in horror. The Russians harassed them all the way. Cossacks struck like lightning-fast raids. Endless pressure. Kutuzov stayed back, never risking all in a single strike. He didn't need to. The land itself was doing his work. And all the while, the memory of Borodino followed them. Veterans who had survived the bloodbath now limped with missing limbs. Officers led companies that no longer existed. The battle had not broken the French army in a day. It had opened the wound. Moscow deepened it. The retreat finished it. By the time Napoleon crossed the Berezina River in November, the Grande Armée was no longer an army. It was a procession of ghosts. He returned to Paris with only a fraction of his force. His empire would never be the same. What began at Borodino had not ended there. It echoed through the snow, through the bones of a shattered army, and through the minds of every survivor. Borodino was a victory, but it was the kind that poisons. It gave Napoleon the field and cost him the war. Some battles are measured in ground taken or flags raised. Borodino is not one of them. It was measured in screams, in smoke, in the silence that follows men who have seen too much. It was the day glory bled out, and history stood still, watching two empires rip each other apart, and neither walk away whole.